They didn't say I couldn't come back. They just sent me a text, as if I were a stranger who might disrupt the guest schedule. Hi, Lillian. Just a heads up, we're listing the cottage for short-term rental this winter, just so you don't get caught off guard. That was it. No mom, no how are you, no invitation to visit, no sign that I had ever belonged there. I read it 3 times, once to understand, once to accept, and once because I simply didn't know what to do next. That cottage wasn't just a house to me. It was the last thing I built with my hands, the last thing that held my husband's warmth after he was gone. I spent 2 years of my life shaping every window frame, laying every cedar plank, sanding every corner until the walls could breathe on their own. And when David and Nina got married, I gave it to them not because I had to, but because it felt right. Because family, to me, meant something permanent. Back then, Nina called it a sanctuary. She took pictures of every corner and posted them online with captions like, "My dream home blessed by love." Back then, David still called me Mom. Not Lil, not her, just Mom. And I used to sit on that wraparound porch every December, watching the tide come in with a mug of hot cider, waiting for Mason to come running out yelling, "Grandma, I thought this year would be the same." I'd even started packing. I'd picked out a warm new scarf for Nina, blue-gray like the coastline she loved, a wooden puzzle for Mason, specialty coffee beans for David, the kind I used to bring back from the farmer's market. I'd tucked it all into a small suitcase and smiled to myself. I didn't expect fireworks, just a seat at the table, a room to rest, a porch to watch the winter roll in. But instead, I got a text. Just a text. And that's when I understood. I wasn't being forgotten. I was being cleared out, gently. Politely, permanently. I wasn't evicted. I was simply reminded that I no longer lived there. The cottage didn't come from blueprints or builders or bank loans. It came from aching hands and long afternoons, from quiet grief turned into pine and nail. After my husband Harold passed, people said I should downsize, move in with someone, start fresh somewhere quieter, but I couldn't. I needed something to hold, something to fix, something to pour myself into before the loneliness consumed me. So I bought a small plot by the bay, barely more than a sloping hill and a stand of stubborn fir trees, and I started building, not because I was an expert, but because Harold and I used to dream about retiring somewhere near water, with gulls overhead and wind in the windows. He left behind his tools, his sketchbook full of silly cottage drawings, and one old wooden handle hammer engraved with cross and sun that he'd made long before we ever knew we'd only have one son. I worked slow at first, just mornings, cutting, sanding, stopping for tea, but soon the rhythm came. I would wake before dawn, tie back my hair, and let the silence of the land fill me up like breath. There were days I cried while driving nails into the frame, not out of sorrow, but from the strange, tender joy of doing something that felt like him and me, still together somehow. The porch was my favorite part. Harold always said every good home needs a porch that can hold a secret. So I made it wide, facing the sea, with beams thick enough to lean a life against. 2 winters and 1 very persistent raccoon later, it was finished small, simple, warm. 3 bedrooms, a long kitchen, a cedar-lined closet where I placed his flannel shirts, and a stone fireplace that creaked when the wind pressed too hard. I called David to see it. He and Nina had just gotten engaged, young, glowing, full of city buzz and startup dreams. They stood in the doorway that afternoon, mouths slightly open, like they had just walked into a photograph. Nina touched the countertops and whispered, "It smells like peace in here." David wrapped his arms around me and said, "Mom, this is more than a house." And before I even knew what I was doing, I handed over the keys. I told them it was theirs, a wedding gift, a home to start from. David protested at first, but I insisted. I didn't need much. I could rent a small place nearby, come visit, stay over in the guest room when needed. I didn't want to own anything anymore. I wanted to give, to offer something that would hold them steady. That first year was full of warmth. I would stop by with my cinnamon bread, sometimes help Nina rearrange the living room for her blog photos. She used to call me Miss Lil in that sweet, teasing voice like I was her favorite character in a novel. We planted a lavender patch together. We painted the nursery when Mason was on the way. I remember the day he was born, David sobbing into my shoulder, Nina squeezing my hand until her nails dug crescent moons into my skin. When they brought Mason home, I was the one who stayed overnight to help, who rocked him when he cried, who made broth and washed sheets and whispered lullabies that hadn't been sung in decades. I didn't expect gratitude. I didn't want applause. I just wanted to be useful, wanted to be near. And for a time, that cottage echoed with life back then, with baby coos and tired footsteps and Sunday music drifting from the radio. We would sit on the porch, all three of us, wrapped in blankets, watching Mason gum a wooden spoon, laughing like fools. Sometimes Nina would take a photo and say, 3 generations of strength. Sometimes David would kiss my cheek and say, Mom, thank you. And in those moments, I believed I had done something right. That in all the quiet years, in all the choices that looked small from the outside, I had built something good, something lasting. I thought, this would be it. My place in the story. Not as the center, just as someone who belonged in the frame, who'd earned her corner by love, not demand. But the years passed quickly, and like waves on a shoreline, things began to erode so slowly I didn't notice at first. The thank yous turned to texts. The hugs became nods. Nina's decor shifted from cozy to curated. The porch grew less a place to gather and more a backdrop for sponsored posts. Still, I didn't ask for more. I stayed on the sidelines, cheering quietly, sending groceries when I knew the budget was tight, and always paying that little rental nearby so I'd never be far. Because this wasn't just their home. It was a piece of my heart I'd carved into walls. A prayer in plank and plaster. A shelter that held more than just weather, but time. Time has a way of testing what was never named out loud. I never wrote a contract, never asked for promises. I just trusted love to remember me, to hold me, even when everything else changed. I didn't build that cottage for myself. I just never imagined I'd have to ask for permission to come inside. The first time David called me Lil instead of Mom, I was standing by the kitchen sink, rinsing the same teacup I had used every visit for 5 years, the blue porcelain one with the chipped edge that Mason once called the sea mug. It was a small moment, almost too soft to notice, like a shadow moving across a closed door. Hey, Lil, do you mind handing me the charger, he said, without looking up from his phone. I froze, hand wet, the cup slipping slightly. I passed him the charger, nodded, said nothing. Maybe he didn't mean anything by it. Maybe it was just casual, a slip of tongue, the kind of thing you don't correct in front of a child. But once a name changes, something else does too. Nina didn't call me anything anymore. Not Mom, not Miss Lil, not even you half the time, just glances, gestures, efficient communication like I was part of the furniture they hadn't gotten around to replacing. The lavender patch we had planted together in the side yard, our hands caked in mud and laughter, was gone the next summer, paved over with slate stones and potted succulents. More curated, Nina said when I paused by the window. It fits the aesthetic. I nodded. Of course. Nothing wrong with aesthetic. The old red corduroy couch where I used to read to Mason was donated without warning, replaced with a minimal cream set that didn't creak, didn't hold history, didn't ask for room. David saw my face. It didn't match the palette, he said gently, like a man breaking news to a child. We'll get you something more comfortable next time. But there never was a next time. Slowly, my presence became an interference, not loud, not cruel, just inconvenient. The cinnamon bread I baked was politely declined because Mason might have a gluten sensitivity. My offers to babysit were thanked and redirected to their regular sitter. I offered to repaint the porch railing. David said they were hiring professionals now. My hands, the same ones that had laid the beams of that porch, no longer belonged to the home they helped create. One day, Nina posted a photo of the living room, sun-soaked, softly filtered, and wrote, "This space is my calm, inspired by my mother Gloria's timeless touch." Gloria, her mother, the woman who came in with polished nails and complaints about humidity. The woman who once whispered to me, "This place is so rustic." I stared at the caption, read it twice. Not a word about me. Not a hint that the woman who built the cottage was still alive, still 3 blocks away, still bringing soup when Mason caught a cold. I closed my phone and sat down in the dark, hands on my knees, not angry, not heartbroken, just invisible. There was no fight, no confrontation, just erasure by omission, one memory at a time. I watched as my old handmade coat rack disappeared from the entryway, replaced by a sleek brass one that wobbled slightly. I noticed how Mason started calling me Grandma Lil instead of just Grandma. He said it with a smile, innocent, curious, but each syllable sounded like distance. I once overheard him ask Nina, "Did Grandma Lil live in this house before it was nice?" And Nina laughed light and airy and said, "She helped us get started, sweetie. Helped us get started." Like I had been a loan or a discount, not the very foundation they stood on. The guest room I once slept in had turned into Nina's filming studio, ring light, backdrops, samples laid out like museum exhibits. "You don't mind the couch, do you?" she asked. "It's just for the weekend." I didn't mind. I tucked my overnight bag behind a chair and tried not to take up too much space. That weekend, I offered to cook dinner. Nina said they'd ordered in. I offered to set the table. David said Mason liked it more casual these days. I offered to leave early. No one stopped me. That night, I lay on the couch, knees curled, blanket too short, and watched them walk past me, whispering plans, wine glasses in hand. I watched my own silence grow legs and sit beside me like a second self. I thought of the way David used to call at midnight when Mason was teething, the way Nina once held my hand during labor, trembling and grateful, the way they used to ask for my advice, my help, my presence. Now, they had ring lights and filters and curated captions. They had Gloria's taste, a sitter on speed dial, and a Wi-Fi network named Casa de C plus N no L. No one told me I wasn't part of it anymore. They just stopped including me until I had to ask where I stood. But even then, I didn't, because asking would mean hearing the answer. And I wasn't ready. Not yet. I thought maybe it was just a season. Maybe things would swing back around. Maybe I was being too sensitive. I held on to that maybe like a raft in rising water. I held on to every maybe, because the truth felt like a storm I wasn't ready to name. They didn't kick me out of their lives. They just kept opening the door wider until I walked out on my own. I started packing 2 weeks before Christmas, not because I had too much to bring, but because I wanted to feel like I was going somewhere that mattered, somewhere I still belonged. I picked out a warm new scarf for Nina, ash blue, soft as breath, just like the color she wore in one of her old posts that once said, "Nothing beats handmade love." For Mason, I found a wooden puzzle shaped like whales and ships, the kind he used to love before everything turned digital. For David, I ordered a bag of roasted coffee beans from a small roaster we used to visit on Saturdays, before they moved into the cottage. I even tucked in a tin of homemade cookies, butter-rich and dusted with cinnamon, and a handwritten card. "See you soon. Can't wait to be with you all." I set the 2 suitcases by the door, zipped and ready. Each time I passed them, I felt a flutter, not quite joy, not quite fear, but something in between. I imagined us at the dinner table again, Mason sticky-fingered and laughing, Nina humming in the kitchen, David carving the turkey, and me just sitting there, breathing in the sound of family. Then, one evening, the phone rang. I smiled when I saw Nina's name. I thought maybe she was calling to ask what pie I'd be bringing. Maybe she wanted to borrow my old table runner. "Hi, Mom," she said, and I knew instantly something was wrong. Her voice was breezy but not natural, a kind of politeness stretched too tight. "Just checking. Have you already booked your ticket?" I hesitated, hand still on the second suitcase. "Everything's ready," I said gently. "Just waiting to head out." "Why?" There was a pause, a shift in air. "Todd wants to talk to you for a minute," she said, almost in a whisper. Before I could ask why, the phone clicked. "Hi there. Lillian." Todd said David, my son, now formal, like he was addressing a stranger. "This Christmas, it might not be the best time for you to come." The words came slow, careful, dipped in courtesy, and dipped again in distance. I blinked. "Why did something happen?" "Oh, nothing serious," he said quickly. "It's just that Nina's parents are flying in this year. They're both getting older. Light sleepers. You know. And well, there's only 3 bedrooms." I waited. I didn't understand. "There's one for your dad, one for your mom, and one for us. So, you see, it's just not a great setup." I felt something cold bloom in my chest, not pain, not anger, just disbelief, slow and creeping like frost. "I can sleep on the couch," I said, too quickly. "I don't mind. It's the holidays. I can bring an air mattress if that helps." He paused. "Too long. Lillian, you really don't have to put yourself through that. The house is going to be full and noisy, not ideal for resting. Plus, Nina and I are both exhausted from work." We were kind of hoping for a quiet holiday, just the 4 of us. Nothing personal. Of course. Of course. I felt the phone getting heavier in my hand, like it carried the weight of every casserole. Every night I rocked Mason to sleep. Every dollar I transferred into their account without ever being asked. "David," I said softly, "can I speak to Nina again?" Another pause. Then a rustle. "Mom." Her voice was thinner now, trembling. "Please don't be upset. It's just Todd's parents. They're not well, and they really need a good rest." Her words trailed off. And then, in the background, I heard it, a throat being cleared. A soft, pointed warning. She didn't say don't come, but she didn't say come either. She didn't say we want you here. She didn't say we'll make room. She said nothing. And in that nothing, I heard everything. "All right," I said. I made my voice as even as I could, holding every shred of dignity like it was the only thing I had left. "Thank you for letting me know." I hung up. The moment the line went dead, the silence flooded in like a tide. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time, eyes fixed on the suitcases by the door, the one with the blue scarf, the one with Mason's gift, the one with the cookies and the card, everything wrapped, everything chosen with care, everything waiting for a door that would never open. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the kitchen, lights off, listening to the sound of a fridge humming, the wind brushing against the windows, the steady pulse of rejection playing on repeat in my ears. I remembered the day I signed over the cottage. David was crying. Nina hugged me and said, "This will always be your home too. Lillian, always, always." A word that now tasted like ashes. I made tea just to have something to hold. The warmth helped keep the shaking away. I opened my laptop, clicked through old photos. The first Christmas we spent there, Nina in a red sweater, David carving ham, me holding Mason with mashed potatoes on my shirt. I kept staring at that image, trying to find the exact moment when I started becoming background. I wasn't asked to leave. I was just no longer expected to arrive. I didn't cancel Christmas. I didn't text back or call again or ask them to reconsider. I just sat in the quiet and let the stillness do what words never could. The suitcases stayed by the door for 3 more days. I didn't unpack them. I didn't touch the wrapping paper. I just walked past them, again and again, like a reminder of something soft that had curdled into humiliation. Every time my phone buzzed, I hoped it would be David. I hoped he'd say they made a mistake, that there was room after all, that they'd cleared the guest studio and laid out my old flannel sheets. But the screen stayed silent. The bank, however, did send a notification just like always. Your monthly transfer of $1,500 is scheduled for December 23rd. I stared at it for a long time. That transfer had become a ritual, not for them, but for me, a thread I clung to. Even when everything else was unraveling, I had never missed a payment. Even when groceries got expensive, even when my roof leaked last spring and I had to choose between repairs and new glasses, even when I ate plain oatmeal for dinner so Mason could have organic formula, that money, month after month, felt like love in numeric form, my way of saying, "You're still my son. You still matter." But now that line in my budget felt like an insult to my own backbone. I didn't respond to the bank reminder. I didn't log in. I didn't click anything. I just deleted the notification and folded my hands in my lap. Not out of revenge, not out of pettiness, but because for the first time, I realized I wasn't giving anymore. I was paying for access, paying to be tolerated, paying to be invisible in their carefully curated life. That night, I didn't sleep much. I took out an old notebook and flipped through old list groceries, baby supplies, project ideas. Then I turned to a blank page and wrote just one sentence. What do they still see me, as I left the question unanswered? I didn't need to finish it. The silence had already done that. On Christmas Eve, I lit a candle in the kitchen and played an old jazz record I hadn't touched in years. I poured myself a cup of cider and took the cookies I'd made for Mason out of the tin. I ate one. Just one. It crumbled gently, sweet and warm, and tasted like something I used to be good at. I wrapped the rest, labeled the tin for neighbors, and left it outside Jane's door down the hall. She had 3 grandkids coming over, and I figured someone might appreciate cinnamon. At midnight, my phone buzzed. It was Nina. Just a text. No photo, no call, no apology. Just hope you're staying warm. Merry Christmas from all of us. From all of us. I stared at the words, typed out "you too," then deleted it, put the phone face down. I went to bed and didn't dream. The next morning, the sun came up through the blinds like it always does. The world didn't notice I'd been left behind, but I did. I noticed in the way my heart didn't reach for the kettle right away. I noticed in the way I didn't set a second plate at the table, even out of habit. I noticed in the way I didn't think to check my email, because no one would be writing anything that mattered. I didn't cry. Not that day, or the next. But the space inside me, the one that used to stretch open every December like a window to let love in, stayed shut. Cold. Still. By New Year's Eve, I had made a decision. Quiet and firm. No ceremony. No drama. I opened my laptop, pulled up the bank site, and canceled the recurring transfer. No message. No warning. Just a checkbox and a click. It was done in under 10 seconds. 10 seconds to stop what had once felt like my only tether to the people I built my life around. Afterward, I sat with my hands folded. The air didn't shift. The world didn't shatter. It was just quiet. But not the kind of quiet that follows a fight. The kind of quiet that comes after finally letting go of a rope you didn't realize was cutting into your palms. A few days later, Nina called. Her voice was sweet. Too sweet. coated in the kind of niceness that made my stomach tighten. "Hey, Mom, how have you been? It's gotten so cold." "Right. Make sure you're staying bundled up." I responded with politeness, with distance. "I'm fine. Thanks for checking in." Then came the pause, the drift, the circling. I could hear her trying to time it just right. And then, casually, "Oh, by the way, did something happen with the bank? I think the monthly transfer didn't come through. Maybe it's a glitch." I waited. Let the silence hang long enough to become a shape. "No glitch," I said softly. I didn't forget. The silence on her end froze. I could hear her trying to process that, to reorient herself in the conversation. "Oh," she said. Then faster. "I mean, I'm not saying we expect it. It's just, with everything due this month." "I know," I said, calm, clear. "But you said you needed space." "This is part of that." I didn't explain further. I didn't need to, because I knew and she knew that this wasn't about money. It was about being written out of their lives while still being expected to foot the subscription fee. I didn't slam any doors. I just stopped knocking on the ones they quietly locked behind me. It happened on a Thursday, at the market down by the wharf, when I ran into Gloria Nina's mother in the cheese aisle of all places, where everything smelled of salt and age. She was wearing a long camel coat and red lipstick that didn't quite stay within the lines, holding a tiny wheel of brie like it was a badge of taste. She saw me before I could turn away. "Lillian," she sang, drawing out the syllables like an old friend, though we had never been more than polite. "Good to see you. I didn't know you were still around." I blinked. "Still around?" "Well," she said, lowering her voice and leaning in slightly. "Nina said you'd moved on. Downsized. Starting fresh somewhere more manageable." I didn't respond. Not because I couldn't, but because something inside me had gone very still. She smiled as if that settled it. "Anyway, they've really made the place their own, haven't they? Such vision. I always told Nina she had an eye." I nodded once, said, "Excuse me," and walked away before I could taste bile behind my tongue. I drove home with groceries I didn't remember choosing and sat in my car with the engine off, staring at the cracked edge of the dashboard. The cottage. The one I built with my own hands. The one I signed over with a ribbon and a hug. The one they now told people had come from Gloria's inspiration. She hadn't painted a wall, hadn't scrubbed a floor, hadn't carried Mason down the stairs at 2 a.m. during his first fever. But now, in the new story, she was the muse, the matriarch, the name they repeated, and I was a footnote they edited out. I went inside and pulled out the old file box I kept beneath my bed. Inside were birth certificates, tax forms, and the original deed to the cottage. My name was still on the document alongside David's. I had forgotten that, or maybe I had let myself forget. Because remembering would mean admitting I still had a piece of something I thought I had given away entirely. I dug deeper and found the printout from the lawyer's office, the one from 3 years ago when David and Nina asked if I'd consider transferring full title to help with refinancing. I'd said yes. Of course I had. But it had never been finalized. The paperwork had been delayed some clerical backlog, and they never followed up. My name was still there. I sat back, the weight of that realization like a stone in my throat. They never mentioned it, never asked again. Maybe they assumed it was done, or maybe they knew and counted on me never looking. I stared at the page, fingers trembling slightly, and felt something shift. Not anger, not pride, something colder, cleaner. A kind of awakening that feels like stepping out of fog and realizing you've been walking toward the wrong house. I took the deed, folded it carefully, and placed it on the table. The next morning, I called a lawyer, not to demand anything, not to fight, just to remove myself, to release it, to say on paper what they had already said with silence. I signed the withdrawal document 2 days later. No fanfare, just ink and air. Then I boxed up the last thing I had ever left in that cottage, the engraved hammer Harold had given me when we first talked about building it. Cross and Son, it read, though there was never a son to pass it to. I wrapped it in an old tea towel, tucked a note beside it. For the house you made your own, may it never forget where it came from. I mailed it with no return address. They didn't rewrite the story all at once. They just kept retelling it without me until even I started to believe I hadn't been part of it. I didn't tell anyone I had removed my name from the deed. I didn't send a copy. I didn't announce it in a letter or wrap it in a lecture. I just signed the papers, slid them into the envelope, and walked them to the mailbox myself. The snow was falling that day, soft and sideways, brushing my face like breath I didn't ask for. I wore the same coat I had varnished the porch in years ago, back when the wood still smelled like fresh cedar and hope. The mailbox creaked when I opened it, like it knew something was ending. I let the envelope drop. The sound it made wasn't loud, but inside me it echoed. A door closed, quietly, finally. I walked home through the snow without looking back. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the hammer I hadn't yet mailed, the one I had wrapped in the towel with Harold's initials still stitched into the corner. Cross and Son, it said, though no son had ever built anything beside me. I turned it over in my hand again and again, feeling the worn grip, the memory of how it used to fit in Harold's palm like it was born there. David never liked tools, said they smelled like dust and rust. But that didn't stop me from handing him the handle the day we finished framing the cottage and saying, "One day this will mean something." I unwrapped the hammer, just to look at it one more time. The engraving had faded, the letters shallow now, but still there. Proof, not of inheritance but of effort, of story, of presence. And that's when I realized I didn't need to send it, not because I wanted to keep it, but because it didn't belong to them anymore. It never really had. That hammer had built the place, and now it would stay with me, not out of bitterness, but to remind myself I still carried the ability to make something new. I put it back in the drawer, closed it gently. In the morning, I went to the back closet, pulled out my old blue duffel bag, the one with the frayed strap and the coffee stain from a trip to Oregon in '99. I filled it with what I had left that was truly mine, a stack of letters from Harold, a wool blanket from my mother, and a small wooden box of buttons Mason had once collected for me. I called a local woman named Sadie, who ran a crafting group out of the church basement, and asked if she still needed help teaching beginners. "Are you kidding?" she laughed. "We've got 10 women and no patience. Come as soon as you want." I said I'd come Monday. No one knew I was doing it. No one needed to. It wasn't about making a point. It was about making space. That week, I cleared the shelf where Nina's photo of Mason had once sat, the one of him asleep on my chest after his first haircut. They must have taken the original. I let the empty frame fall forward and left it there. A gentle tilt. A small surrender. I wrote no angry letters. I posted nothing. I told no one. But inside me, something shifted, like a woman standing in a doorway too long who finally decides the cold on her back is not worth the hope on her face. I boiled water. I sewed up a tear in my cardigan. I trimmed the dead leaves off my balcony plant. Nothing remarkable. But each act whispered, "You still exist." And that was enough. I didn't scream. I didn't slam anything. I just moved quietly. The way you do when the house you once built has turned into a museum you're no longer allowed to walk through. I didn't take anything back. I just stopped leaving the door open behind me. It was still dark when the doorbell rang, not the kind of dark that feels like rest, but the kind that feels like something's gone wrong. I was tying my apron, halfway through deciding whether I'd make oatmeal or eggs, when the buzz broke through the silence like a crack in glass. I didn't rush. I never rush anymore. I opened the door slowly, carefully, and there he was, David, standing stiff in his city coat, jaw tight, eyes wild, and in his arms, Mason, half asleep, flushed red, his nose crusted and breath shallow. "He's got a fever," David said, not quite looking at me, shifting Mason's weight like a burden he couldn't balance. "We've got a thing, a campaign. We can't cancel. You two figure it out." Then, without another word, he placed Mason in my arms and turned, just turned, walked back down the hallway like someone who had dropped off a parcel. Not a child. "No, thank you. No, I'm sorry. Not even I trust you." Just distance, retreating footsteps, and a slam of the lobby door. I looked down at Mason. His face was hot, his eyelids heavy, his breath raspy like a tiny engine running out of fuel. His coat was zipped wrong, his socks mismatched, one glove missing. I carried him in without speaking, laid him gently on the couch, stripped off the outer layers with careful hands. His skin was damp, his lips cracked. I called softly, "Mason, can you hear me?" He blinked once, murmured, "Grandma," and reached for my wrist like a docked boat trying to tether itself. I kissed his forehead. "It's all right, sweetheart. I've got you." I moved like I was built for this. Because all those years they called me too much, too close, too involved. All they really meant was you were there when we needed you. I boiled water. I found the children's medicine I always kept, even when they stopped asking. I ran a cloth under cold water and pressed it to his forehead. I searched for fever patches in the drawer where I kept old batteries and stray buttons. I didn't stop moving for hours. Amy texted once, "Thanks, Mom. We'll grab him Friday." Friday. It was Wednesday. She didn't ask how he was. She didn't ask what his temperature was, or whether he was eating, or if he cried in the night. Just grab him, like a bag, like something forgotten in the back seat. Mason whimpered through the night. I held him close, whispering stories into the warm curve of his ear. The next morning, I made him toast. He nibbled at it, eyes still glassy. I watched cartoons with him curled beside me. I read to him from an old book about bears who build boats. And when he asked, "Grandma, are we home?" I said, "Yes, for now, we are." On the third day, Nina called. Her voice was quick, clipped, like she was squeezing me into her schedule. "Hey, just checking. How's he doing?" I told her. She said, "Good, good. Just keep doing what you're doing. We'll be by around 6. No one said sorry. No one said thank you. No one asked if I'd slept. That evening, they came. David looked tired but not apologetic. Nina wore sunglasses, though the sun was already gone. They stepped inside like guests. David scooped Mason up, barely glancing at me. "Ready to go, buddy?" he asked. Mason didn't answer. Nina looked around the apartment and said, "Still so cozy in here." I nodded, said nothing. As they walked out, Mason turned and said, "Grandma, are we still boats?" I smiled softly. "Always." They left. The door closed, and just like that, the warmth walked out again. I didn't cry. I just picked up the blanket he had used and folded it with slow, even hands. Later that night, I sat by the window and watched the lights in the building across the street flicker on, one by one. Somewhere in there, someone was probably holding soup for someone else. Somewhere, a mother was probably being asked to stay a little longer. But here, in this little rented square of silence, no one was asking me to stay. They were asking me to function, to fill in, to hold their child while they held their brand. I looked at the tea mug on the table. It still had a faint imprint of Mason's lip on the rim. I didn't wash it. Not yet. I just stared at it, thinking, maybe love is a job you don't retire from, but there comes a day when you stop clocking in uninvited. They didn't abandon him. They just left him where they knew someone would love him enough not to say no. I never expected an apology. Not after the way they walked out with Mason wrapped in a coat that I had dried by the heater overnight. Not after they sent one emoji of a heart the next day with no words attached. I never expected them to say thank you for the medicine, or the meals, or the lullabies whispered when no one else was listening. But a part of me, the soft part that still held memories like bruises, hoped they'd at least pause long enough to wonder if they'd gone too far. They didn't. A week passed, then two, and then I saw a new video Nina posted, titled Family Roots Where It All Began. The thumbnail was a shot of the cottage porch at golden hour, draped in fairy lights, a steaming mug in hand, Gloria's. The caption read, "Honoring the woman who taught me everything about home." I didn't even click play. I just sat there, blinking at the screen, letting the lie hang in the air like steam that would never settle. I thought of all the nights I had sanded that porch by lantern light, fingertips raw, throat hoarse from the cold. I thought of the time Mason fell asleep on my lap out there, and I held him for hours, afraid any movement would wake him. I thought of the box I had left behind, the one with the photos, the handwritten labels for each drawer, the list of emergency contacts I taped to the fridge, and I realized they hadn't just erased me. They had replaced me gently, completely, strategically, completely. Like a shadow they adjusted for better lighting. I didn't throw my phone. I didn't send a message. I didn't rage. I just stood up and walked to the drawer where I kept my last copy of the deed cancellation and tucked it into the back of a book I hadn't opened in years. A book of poetry Harold gave me once, when we still believed that some words could save people. I sat at the kitchen table and wrote a letter. Not to them, to myself. Just a few lines. You gave. They took. And then they changed the locks and asked why you were still knocking. I folded the page and slid it into the envelope marked papers to keep. Then I looked around the apartment. The curtains, the cracked linoleum, the tiny balcony with the struggling basil plant, and I decided it was time. Not to move away, not to escape, but to rebuild. Somewhere not haunted. Somewhere that didn't echo with versions of me I no longer wanted to carry. I packed slowly, deliberately, just the essentials. A few quilts, my journals, a photo of Mason that hadn't been filtered or framed, just him, barefoot and laughing, covered in flour. I found a listing 2 towns over, a small room above a bakery. The landlady said it smelled like cinnamon year-round. I signed the lease without blinking. I didn't tell David. I didn't tell Nina. I left no forwarding address. Only the necessary documents updated quietly. In the bakery window, I placed a small potted plant. In the evenings, I taught a handful of local women how to repair old fabrics, how to stitch without perfection, how to mend without apology. We laughed. We shared stories. No one knew my last name. No one asked who I had once been to someone else. And in that anonymity, I began to breathe again. One morning, I found the hammer in my bag. I'd brought it without thinking. I took it out, polished the handle, and set it on a shelf above the stove. It didn't need to build anymore. It just needed to be seen. Weeks passed, then months, no calls, no cards, but I didn't wilt. I didn't shrink. I grew into myself in silence, in the quiet joy of being useful to no one but me. And then one day, as the first snow began to fall, I wrote a note and left it folded on my windowsill. It wasn't for them. It was for the woman I had once been, the one who believed her worth depended on how many people needed her. You are not a home they forgot. You are not a room they redecorated. You are not a story they chose not to tell. You are still here, still whole, still building. That evening, I poured a cup of tea, stepped out onto the balcony, and watched the lights below flicker on one by one. No porch, no cottage, no curated family photos, just the quiet warmth of a life that finally belonged only to me. I wasn't the house they left behind. I was the woman who built it, and then walked away before it collapsed on top of her. I no longer count the days between phone calls. I no longer check my inbox at midnight or keep the ringer on in case someone suddenly remembers they miss me. I no longer rehearse what I would say if David ever showed up at my door with regret in his eyes, or if Nina ever sent a message that began with, "I'm sorry." I don't imagine those scenarios anymore. Not because I've hardened, but because I've healed in a direction they no longer walk. Some mornings I still reach for the extra mug out of habit, the one I used to set for Mason, the one that held warm cocoa and laughter with missing front teeth. But I don't cry when I put it back. I just let the silence fold itself around me like a familiar coat. Not cold, not cruel, just quiet. I kept teaching. The women in town now know me not as a mother or a grandmother or a giver they forgot to thank, but as Lil, the one who can fix any fray with a needle and listen without ever asking for anything back. We meet every Wednesday in the sunroom of the library, and last week, someone brought banana bread and said, "You remind me of the woman I want to be when I grow up." I didn't know what to say, so I just smiled and said, "Then we'll grow up together." Some nights I sit by the little window that faces the sea and think about the cottage not with longing, but with clarity. I don't wish to be back there. I don't wish for a redo. I just wish I had seen it sooner, that moment when love quietly tipped into transaction, when care became expectation, and when the hands I reached out with were only held when it was convenient. I no longer leave the porch light on. I no longer dream that they'll turn around. I still love them. Yes, but from here, from this distance, where my breath doesn't have to catch every time someone says, "Family." I saw Mason once, unexpectedly, at a festival near town. He was holding Gloria's hand, face painted like a tiger,